Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's another warm welcome to this series of discussions on environment, peace building, and transitional justice. This is the third webinar in a series of at least 12 webinars that seek to hear views and facilitate discussions on this important topic, especially as we continue to witness issues related to countries that are transitioning from conflict to peace and hopefully stability within the continent, issues of climate change, issues related to environmental crime and abuses, and also enhanced efforts at environmental management. Thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Munini Mutuku, a member of the Bosch Alumni Network, and also a member of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. Allow me to appreciate the support and recognize the partnership that is making this series possible. The Bosch Alumni Network, led by coordinator Sarah Hamel, and also the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, that is led by the president, Carl Brook. Our topic today is environment, peace building, and transitional justice. And we are privileged to have at least 4 panelists who are present with us. John Body, who is coming in from Africa, the African Union, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Professor Tim Moreithi from Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, calling in from Cape Town, South Africa. Margaret Ojok, Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, calling in from Kampala, Uganda, and Elizabeth Panteren from Northern Ridgeland Trust, calling in from Kenya. These discussions are part of a larger initiative, The Road to Geneva, which is an inclusive process that is providing a platform for diverse voices and themes from the various regions around the world on matters environment and peace building. This is leading to the second International Conference on Environmental Peace Building that will take place in Geneva in February 2022, hopefully COVID protocols allowing. A link with more information on the road to Geneva will be shared in the chat section. These discussions are also part of another initiative that seeks to understand the practice of transitional justice as it relates to environment and peace building. The adoption of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy in 2019 is a milestone in providing guidelines to support the redress of crimes and human rights abuses within the continent. These abuses and crimes are especially related to violent conflict and witnessed in various countries where, more often than not, natural resources are an issue of concern. The question still lingers on the place of environmental issues in natural resources in these transitional justice practices and the discussions therein. Our panelists today will shed more light into these 3 concepts and how they interrelate: environment, peace building, and transitional justice. Before we begin, a few logistical comments. Feel free to ask questions. You can use the chat that is made available. If you ask a specific question to a specific panelist, kindly remember to mention the name so that that question goes to that specific panelist. And also, just to remind you that our discussion for today is being recorded, so the link will be made available, or you can access it at the Environmental Peacebuilding Association website. Allow us to mute all our participants so that we can minimize any background noise. And I would like to apologize in advance if the background noise is coming from the side of the panelists and the facilitators. Without much ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, who is John Bondi. John Bondi is giving us an overview of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. He is a senior political officer in the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security at the African Union Commission, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. He is also a fellow of the United Nations Regional Human Rights System. He supervises human rights and transitional justice within the Governance and Conflict Prevention Division of the department. John holds 2 master's degrees, a master's in political science from University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and a master's in governance and development from the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex, Brighton, United Kingdom. John, you're welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monini, and It is a privilege for me to be part of this meeting, and I bring greeting from the management of the African Union Commission. I don't know whether the protocol is not to show our face because Monini did not show her face. Well, I think the topic before me is just an overview of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And let me really commend the organizers of this meeting because it is an opportunity for us to also showcase the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. So we are really very grateful from the African Union that you are also helping us to popularize this particular policy document. Briefly, how many minutes do I have, or how many hours, Munini?
At least you have 15 to 20 minutes.
Wow. Okay, let me quickly, because it's a big document, so let me quickly go through. Briefly, my presentation will be divided into 7 parts: the introductory aspect, the development and the adoption of the policy, and also the new development on transitional justice initiatives on the continent. And I will talk about the objectives and the principles of the policy. Also, the indicative elements of the policy, which we some also refer to as the pillars of the policy, then actors, processes, and implementation of the policy, then conclusion. In time of the transitional justice, as we all know, I believe that majority of us, you are all used to what transitional justice is. As we all know, that transitional justice is not new on the continent in Africa. We have had different versions of transitional justice programs or mechanisms in countries like Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Sudan, Ghana, Togo, Morocco, Burundi, Rwanda, and ongoing in countries like Libya. So it is not new. That is one point. The second point that needs to be made is that there are several provisions on transitional justice in African Union and also in regional economic communities, policy and normative frameworks. But suffice to say that there was no single comprehensive documents on the continent at regional nor continental on transitional justice before the adoption of the AU Transitional Justice Policy in 2019. So, and as a result of this, the process of developing what is now known as the African Union Transitional Justice Policy started almost a decade ago. And I will not, because of our time, I will not take us through the actors that were involved and all the rest of them. But one thing that needs to be emphasized is that it took a long time, almost 10 years, for the African Union to be able to finalize that document. And that tells us the level of consultation, participation of different stakeholders, the youth, the civil society, the government officials, the private sector, and so on. And that is the reason why it is not, difficult to explain why that policy is popular today. Of recent, there is a publication in Germany where reference is being made to that policy as a good practice in time of policy development on transitional justice. So the legitimacy of that document is very fundamental, and the support to that document is also very important, and that is what gave us the leeway for us to be able to see the success behind the development of that particular policy. So that is the second point that needs to be made. Now, it is also important for us to understand that in addition to the different stakeholders, the civil society organizations play a critical role in the development of this policy. And Professor Moretti will bear me witness that there was a heavy, if this word is appropriate now, involvement of the civil society in the development of that policy. And not only that, the African Union member state also appreciate the contribution of the civil society organization, and also the member states also, put themselves into a committee, what we know as the task force on the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, that eventually finalized that document and before it was adopted by the African Union Assembly in February 2009. As earlier indicated, I said transitional justice is not new Africa. What is, however, new on transitional justice is the adoption of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, and new programs that have surfaced in recent time, and also in the and some of these include, for example, you are also aware that Uganda has its own newly adopted transitional justice policy, which is also very important for us to take note of that. Gambia is currently having an ongoing Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission that will end next month. It has been about 2 years now. We have ongoing Libya National Reconciliation Commission. Mali has an ongoing program. Nigeria in the northeast also has a program, and which is also another dimension to transitional justice in Africa, which is the decentralization approach, where we have, a states, about 2 states having their own different transitional justice mechanism, different from the national one. So we also have South Sudan, and we also have the Sudan is currently embarking on TJ, and also Zimbabwe, just to mention a few. At the regional level, it's also very important for us to note that there has been no development as a result of the adoption of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Currently, we have ECOWAS, and we also have IGAD in the East Africa, currently developing a regional transitional justice policy framework, to support their member states in the work that they do. And it is very important to indicate that they draw heavily from the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Now, in time of the policy, briefly, because of our time, the policy is divided into 4 sections. The first section deals with introductions, goals, objective, the rationale for the policy, definition of concepts and principles. Then the second section deals with indicative element, or what we call the pillars of the African Union Transitional Justice policy. Then we have the cross-cutting issues, things like IDPs, refugees, and stateless persons. And finally, we have the actors, processes, and implementations of the mechanism. Now, the section 1 in time of the introduction, development, and adoption of the policy, it is also very important at this outset to emphasize that the African Union Transitional Justice Policy is a soft law. It is not a binding continental framework that spells out how AU member state can or should embark and successfully implement their transitional justice. No ratification is needed, as it is a soft law, like I have said, but its domestication and implementation are critical on the part of the member state. So the policy defines transitional justice as the various formal and traditional or non-formal policy measures and institutional mechanisms that societies, through an inclusive consultation process, adopt in order to overcome past violations, divisions, and inequalities, and to create conditions for both security and democratic and socio-economic transformation. So this is how the African Union Transitional Justice Policy defines what TJ is. In time of the objective and principles of the policy, the overarching objective of the policy is to promote peace, justice, accountability, and to deepen culture of democracy, human rights, and rule of law, and development in post-conflict and post-authoritarian regimes on the continent. It is also important to say that the policy has 6 specific objectives, and they are clearly spelled out in paragraph 2 and 3 of the policy. And some of these objectives, because of our time, I will not be able to go through all of them, indicate improving timeliness, effectiveness, and coordination of TJ in Africa, enhancing social cohesion, national building, and comprehensive state reform, like what is currently being planned for in countries like Libya, and also encouraging and fast-tracking of planning and implementation of reconstruction, national healing, and accountability, among others. And this objective, we can see that these are some of the things that are propelling transitional justice in countries like South Sudan, in countries like Sudan, in countries like Zimbabwe, and other countries that are currently working on their transitional justice. In addition to this, it is also important to say that the policy has 9 principles that underpin the policies, and they are mostly drawn from the African Union Shared Values Instruments. The first one, for example, they are self-explanatory, which I don't need to do too much explanation on all this. The first one is African leadership. The second one, in other words, that transitional justice should not be foreign driven. It should be African led. National and local ownership. The third principle is inclusivity of different actors, all the segment of the society. Equity should be a guiding principle, and non-discrimination. African share values, context specificity, and this is very important. The ideas of borrow, cut and paste, in the implementation of transitional justice should not be the approach. That is the position of the African Union in the policy, that the context should define clearly how a state should go about their transitional justice programs and or mechanism. Synergizing, sequencing, balancing of TJ element are also one of the underlying principles. Others include synergizing, sequencing, and balancing of TJ elements, due regard to gender and generational dimension of violation and transitional processes, like, for example, the issue of gender, cross-cutting issues, very important. The youth issues is very also important. And also cooperation and coherence, capacity building for sustainability, particularly in post-conflict and post-authoritarian environment. So these are the key principle. Now, section 2 deals with what we refer to as indicative elements of the AU Transitional Justice Policy. The policy is made up of 11 indicative elements, or what I refer to as the pillar, and it has recommendation for benchmark and standard for each of the elements on how member states can actually, go about effective implementation of the policy. Now, the first pillar has to do with the peace processes, and this element is concerned with, bringing to an end any ongoing violence or authoritarian practices that can jeopardize the expected peace and unity in the country. So it does include provision of security to citizens in conflict areas, particularly for children and women. And so the mechanisms as provided in the policy for accomplishing this element include peace negotiation and peace agreement among the warring parties. It is also expected that the peace negotiation during this particular mechanism, that agreement will also include transitional justice and mechanisms and also program. Like, for example, what is going on in South Sudan during the peace process. The Chapter 5 of the Revitalized Agreement on South Sudan clearly deals with the issues of transitional justice. So this is what the peace process entails with regard to transitional justice. Then the second pillar has to do with transitional justice commissions, which I believe popularly known as TRC. We have had so many experiences in Kenya, in South Africa, currently ongoing one in the Gambia. So, and it spelled out the roles and expectation of Truth Reconciliation Commission. And TRC is also expected to help in establishing truth, promote national cohesion, justice, and accountability. So this is what it deals with when it comes to Transitional Justice Commission. The third one has to do with the African Traditional Justice Mechanism. And this one particular pillar is very unique elements of the policy in the sense that it differentiates the African Union Transitional Justice approach and or mechanism from the other international mechanisms. It incorporates the African traditional approach to justice, peace, reconciliation, and national cohesion. So the policy does provide guidance on how this can be carried out with benchmarks and standard for a successful traditional justice mechanisms. And it also provides that this type of this mechanism should be carried out within the confines provisions of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So it does take into consideration some bad practices, traditional practices that should not be incorporated into the African Traditional Justice Mechanism. Then the fourth pillar deals with reconciliation and social cohesion. And this is all about bringing cohesion, bringing all the different warring parties together, coming up with different programs to bring about cordial relationship among the different divided groups in the country. Then it also deals with how to deal with the issues of IDP, refugees, and stateless persons. The fifth principle deals with reparation, and this element deals with reparative justice. It covers the following forms of reparation, namely material reparation, collective reparation, moral reparation. It also deals with rehabilitation of victims and healing, in particular the IDPs, refugee, the stateless person, and healing. And this particular pillar is very important because when we talk about transitional justice, people always think about, the reparation in form of physical reparation. But their South Africa experience, for example, shows that what some people just need is just to repair their past, and they just want people that offended them to just say we are sorry, and that is all. So we have different type of reparation, and the policy is very comprehensive in this area. Then the sixth one deals with retributive justice, socio-economic justice, and this element deals with inherent socio-economic injustices, inequality, social exclusion, and political marginalization. And the aim of this pillar is to entrench equity and justice in the reconstruction of the society, and it also has benchmark and pillars on how to successfully carry out this implement this type of mechanism. Then memorialization, which is the seventh pillar, and the aim of this element is to awaken the consciousness of the present and future generation on the gross violation and crimes of the past, and to promote a national commitment of never again should such experience be replicated again. And for example, I believe many of you are aware of the memorialization project in Rwanda. The AU also supported the Gambia to also come up with their own memorialization. And as many of you may be aware, the African Union Commission here at the headquarters, we are currently constructing a human rights memorial where it will showcase, the past documentation relating to red terror experience in Ethiopia, things like colonialism on the continent as in a whole, and apartheid in South Africa, and other serious gross human rights violation, so that whenever people come, and also the future generation can always see what has transpired in terms of gross human rights violation in the past, and commit themselves to say never again should we experience this type of a thing or allow it to happen. Then the third pillar, diversity management, this with how to take care of different diversities in conflict situation, ethnic group, regional diversity, and also to bring about harmonization and cohesion. The ninth pillar deals with the issues of justice and accountability, and this is very, very important. Most often, particularly our friends lawyers, mainly focus in this area, on this area at the detriment of other pillars, but it is also very important to indicate that yes, justice and accountability is expected to be delivered as a matter of privacy through national court, form and tradition. It is also important that where capacity and other related challenges does exist, the policy recommend establishment of special courts, extraordinary chambers, and hybrid court. And this is where regional and sub-regional assistance is very critical in the African Union policy. It also has comprehensive benchmark and standard to guide member states on how to go about it. The policy also recognizes additional justice measures that may consider, and this include plea bargain and pardon, mitigation of sentence and alternative form of punishment, and also amnesties. Then the second to the last pillar, this with the political and institutional reform. And this element is aimed at reforming all defective state institutions across board to guarantee effectiveness and efficiency of social, political, and economic transformation of the state. The benchmark standard include, like for example, constitutional and legal reform. Like many of you that you are familiar with South Sudan, you will see that they are currently working on their constitutional and other legal reform. So these are the type of political and institutional reform that the policy envisages. Post-conflict reconstruction and development program, DDR, and others are some of the important issues that is raised for consideration by the policy. Then the final point is the human and people's right, and this element entails the promotion and institutionalization of culture of human and people's right in the affected AU member state implementing transitional justice, using the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and other AU and REC human rights instruments. The final section, the second to the final section, deals with the cross-cutting issues, and this is where the policy emphasizes the need for women and girls to be involved in the process, children and youth. Like for example, some of you may be aware that the African Union will be starting a training program on Monday, which Professor Mureti is one of our convener and one of our trainers. And what we try to do is to capacitate our youth so that they can be very involved, they can be involved in the transitional justice programs mechanism across the continent. And this is to guide against the usual tokenism with regard to youth, women participation in transitional justice policy. So these cross-cutting issues is one area that we emphasize, and this include persons with disabilities, IDPs, refugee and stateless person, and older person. So we ensure it is our duty according to the policy that in all transitional justice mechanism that these cross-cutting issues must be embedded. The final section of the policies deals with what I call the actors, what the policy called the actors, processes, and implementation mechanism. The policy identifies various actors at all levels of governance, continental, regional, and national level, and also the non-state actors, which is very important. I emphasize this. Their roles, what the roles that they should play, they are spelled out, but the policy emphasizes that the context must also be taken into consideration when defining the roles of these different actors. It also deals with resource mobilization at different levels. As you know, for example, at the continental level, for example, it encouraged the African Union to establish the African Transitional Justice Fund for support to transitional justice implementation in different member states. Knowledge management and advocacy, monitoring, reporting, and review are other important issues that it deals with. In conclusion, in a nutshell, this is what the AU Transitional Justice Policy is all about and how it was developed. But having said that, let me just quickly indicate the issues of environment, which is the focus of this particular discussion. To indicate, we have received some criticism from the different stakeholders. Like, for example, just quickly indicate the issues of environment. To indicate that we have received different criticism. Like, for example, even from Professor Morichi's center in South Africa, I remember somebody came up with an article to say that the policy is limited, you know, in the areas of mental health. And others also have argued that, you know, the policy is also limited, challenge in the areas of environmental issues, particularly considering the nexus between environmental degradation and conflicts on the continent, the Sahel, for example. And when you look at what is going on in the Chad region in West Africa, the conflict between the herders and also the farmers that we ought to have taken into consideration. And we recognize this. But what I need to say is that the first draft of the policy that we submitted to the AU policy organ was very huge, almost about 90 pages. And I remember one of the questions that was asked then was, is this a PhD thesis? And so we were asked to prune it down. And that is the reason why you will realize that it does not include many things. But I quite agree with you that the issues of environment is very important. And that is the reason why context was asked to take into consideration so that in applying this particular policy, member states implementing transitional justice can also use their own initiatives to bring and incorporate other things that probably the policy did not touch. So I think I will just stop at this level for continuation by other panelists. And if there is any question after all, one can respond to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for that very comprehensive presentation and on the overview of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. It's interesting the way it has become very inclusive, especially talking about the cross-cutting issues where we have youth included, and you're actually having a meeting next week to ensure that youth understand the transitional justice policy and that as the future generations, they're actually knowledgeable on what is going on in terms of addressing human rights atrocities that have happened in this continent in the past. Thank you very much for that presentation. Next, allow me to, you're welcome. Allow me to welcome our next presenter, Professor Tim Mureithi. Professor Tim Mureithi will be sharing with us on the concept of transitional justice and the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. In a brief statement, Professor Mureithi is the head of the Peacebuilding Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, and extraordinary professor of African Studies at the Center for African and Gender Studies, University of the Free State in South Africa. He was the 2016 Cloud Anchor Visiting Professor at the Nordic African Institute and Department of Peace and Conflict Research, Uppsala University. He is also a research associate. He's at the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship, and Public Policy in Africa, University of Cape Town. He is many things. He is also an advisor of board he sits in the advisory board membership of several institutions. He's a senior research fellow. He's a lecturer. He has worked at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research in Geneva, amongst other distinguished positions that he holds and that he has held. He obtained his PhD in international relations from Keele University in the UK. Professor Tim Mureithi, karibu sana, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Asante sana Munini, for also that very glowing introduction. Much appreciated. Also, just like to thank my brother John of the African Union for his very proactive engagement with civil society actors, and for also guiding and shepherding this African Union transitional justice policy into fruition and into reality. So I work at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, and we've been working for the last 21 years in the field of transitional justice and peace building. We do this through research, analysis, training, and community dialogues, and we actively seek to build partnerships and work cooperatively with other organizations, Committed Africans, Friends of Africa, and really our agenda is to raise the awareness and to strengthen the capacity of governments and societal actors to take up the issues, some of the issues that you've just heard John speak about, the issues that are mentioned in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And so we're very glad that the Environmental Peacebuilding Association has convened this meeting, and we're very pleased to be participating in this discussion. I think my challenge here is to try to make a link from what John has said to the whole issue of environmental transitional justice, or environmental peace building, because peace building, I think, and transitional justice are very closely related, and in fact they intersect and are linked, and they're not separate fields, but they're in fact fields that complement each other. And we're very much in the mode of asking questions, really. We haven't developed our thinking that extensively as far as environmental TJ in Africa is concerned, but also the African Union itself, makes reference to community land ownership and restitution, but doesn't pronounce explicitly on environmental transitional justice. But this is not a challenge, but this is in fact an opening for us, as actors in this field to in fact push the envelope and work on these issues. In terms of transitional justice, I think John very clearly outlined the concepts around it. I'm not going to repeat what he said. I think in a really short summary, it's dealing with the effects of past conflict or authoritarian rule or colonial rule, to promote redress and accountability for victims and survivors, and to enable countries to build fair and inclusive society and ensure sustainable peace going forward. So it is really about redressing the tensions and deficiencies and legacies of the past. And it really also is very intersectional in its approach to dealing with communal tensions, with national tensions, with regional tensions, which have emerged from colonial legacies, violent conflict, youth insurgency, violent extremism, marginalization due to poverty, inequality, post-electoral violence, natural resource extraction, which is of particular interest to us here, and transboundary conflicts emerging from climate change, which leads to human rights violations and international crimes. So really, transitional justice is about restoring the dignity of human beings who've suffered injustices and violations, healing the past and rebuilding broken individuals, families, communities, nations, and worlds. And ultimately, its goal is to promote reconciliation, which has very deep, resonances with some of the work that is done in terms of addressing the historical violations that have been suffered by the environment. And it is an affirmation. Transitional justice affirms our essential interconnectedness as human beings, and it does challenge the exploitative approach that dominates the world: separation, factionalism, a drive for power, dominion, control, and exploitation, which has led to the environmental destruction that we are currently enduring, as a people of this world. And to a certain extent, then we're all victims and survivors of this historical legacy. And in some communities, the threats to the existence are quite clear and quite open. Um, so when we talk about now trying to bridge these concepts together, environment and the peace building and transitional justice, I think one of the issues that does emerge is that human beings, feel that some human beings, or dominant narratives that we hold as human beings, are, some people believe that we've been put on this planet to have dominion over the planet. It's a very elitist and extractive and exploitative approach to the world, which is not sustainable really in terms of the world going forward. And a key challenge is for us to, in fact, turn that around. The Earth, the planet, is not simply a large piece of rock or a large piece of, inanimate object, but it is in fact very much alive. If we're living on the Earth, it must at some level itself also be a living entity. And here I'm referring to the Gaia theory, which actually speaks to the Earth as being alive, right? And so the environmental damage that we have done to the planet has to be redressed, and somebody or some people have to be held accountable for that. And that's why I think there is a very strong case for, strengthening our approach to environmental transitional justice. The African Union Transitional Justice Policy speaks of processes and mechanisms that can, in fact, provide us with some entry points and some guidance as to, processes that we can adopt to address environmental damage. So TJ, does speak to issues around survival, the protection of resources, such as water, food, which are vital, not only in the post-conflict context, but necessary for human beings to live. There is the issue of the toxicity that now begins to undermine environments that people live in, and the natural resource depletion based on extraction. And as I said, even though the AUTJP does not explicitly pronounce itself on the environment, it does speak a lot to redress, economic redress, social redress, cultural rights, which includes the environmental dimension. And I think that's where we begin to see a good link between what the AUTJP says and what we're trying to pursue in terms of environmental redress and accountability for environmental damage. I think the United Nations Environmental Program has done quite a number of post-conflict reports and has determined that wars leave scars on societies and communities, and armed conflict more often than not entails very extensive damage to key natural resources which are needed for human survival, such as drinking water, installation, agricultural lands, crops, and other foods. And so violence does exacerbate and even pronounce environmental damage. And so it also leads to socioeconomic injustices. And these are some of the issues that have been highlighted in the AUTJP. In Africa, we have a number of cases of environmental extraction that have led to serious damage, such as the the operations of the Shell oil company in Ogoniland in Nigeria in the 80s, and the mining of natural resources from countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in fact, is at the heart of the conflict. Central African Republic, South Sudan, similar situations there. So we do need to explore this dimension of how transitional justice can speak to environmental redress and accountability for past damage, and also how it can speak to future processes that need to be put in place to protect the environment going forward. Transitional justice mechanisms you heard John reference include the dimensions of truth recovery, truth seeking, ascertaining, in fact, what happened, and then processes of making the situation fair and just, retributive or restorative justice, and processes of reparations, so that you have either symbolic or even monetary reparations for past damage, and institutional reform. I think this is also crucial if we're talking about changing the way the world operates and changing the way our institutions work. Institutional reform is also a crucial dimension of transitional justice. And all of these working together contribute towards promoting reconciliation and peace building. And as I mentioned, the key dimension that we need to reconcile ourselves with is with the earth itself, the planet, the sense of separation and the sense that we can exploit it almost indefinitely is a false concept. And we need to challenge that concept and say, rather, we need to be trying to make our engagement and our use of natural resources sustainable so that future generations can benefit from the earth, from the natural resources. And so transitional justice can, in fact, make this case quite strongly, because it is really about, trying to ensure or find out what happened, and then putting in place processes that will redress the situation and also contribute towards peace building with all the other dimensions that I've mentioned. And so there is a strong case for transitional justice to engage with this field. There are deeper dimensions like structural violence that exists. When you exploit the environment, you don't only affect the current generation, you affect future generations. You can have the intergenerational, damage, intergenerational experience of that damage actually being, endured by communities and societies around the world. So there is a strong basis for us to make this case that, the human rights of all people are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and that a healthy and functioning environment is necessary in order to ensure that people can live, have water, health, the right to life, which is ultimately what, in fact, all of our institutions like the United Nations, for example, speaks to directly. Then I think I want to just maybe begin to conclude by talking about the historical legacy of colonialism. I think if we are talking about addressing and restoring, the well-being of those who've endured and suffered violent conflict in the past, I think colonialism also has to fit into the equation. And not only colonialism, but globalization as well has to fit into the equation. And the question then becomes, what can colonial redress and reparation look like? In fact, the African Union Transitional Justice in Section 1 makes a strong reference to the need for to address the legacies of colonialism. And when we juxtapose that onto the environment, it becomes clear that we also need to consider what can and what does colonial redress and reparations look like if our agenda is to restore the relationship between those who were colonized historically and the colonized, so at least the descendants of the colonizers. So we're talking about intergenerational healing. And so that's an important dimension for us to explore going forward. I don't think I want to really say that much more. I can give one or two case studies, such as in Kenya, where the Kenya Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission found that historical grievances over land constituted one of the most important drivers of conflict and ethnic tension in the country. And close to 50% of the statements that were received by the Kenya Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission are related to and touched upon issues or claims around land and environmental, possession. And so it is a very important issue for us, not only in the African continent, I'm sure around the world. And so we need to actively focus on how we can strengthen the advocacy and also the analysis and the research around this, going forward. And so there's an entry point for us to engage the African Union Transitional Justice Policy and to, in fact, work with the document in making cases at the policy level, at training, even for training for, societal members, grassroots communities, and particularly vulnerable communities that have been exploited, and those who live in polluted areas, and those who are agitating for the redistribution of land that was dispossessed from them, that there's a strong remedy, a strong case for remedy within the AUTJP, which can be utilized to address past injustices, but also to lay the foundations for promoting peace going forward. So I'm going to stop there, Munini, and obviously we can have a conversation at the later stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that presentation. A few issues have come up. We're seeing a new issue on colonialism. Very interesting, redress and reparations, and the question of intergenerational healing, land historical injustices that have been seen in Kenya, like you mentioned, South Africa, actually almost in the entire continent, the land issue. And that's why we had the fight for independence, because it was also a question of our land, our territory, and the dispossession of the same. Accountability, the question of needs to repair, reconciliation. You've talked about reconciliation, not only reconciliation between people and people, but people and the environment, because that is the region, the area within which they live. Thank you so much for that presentation and for those points. I really appreciate it. Allow me now to welcome our next presenter, who's Ms. Margaret Ajok. Ms. Margaret Ajok will be sharing with us on the comparative perspectives on environment and transitional justice. She is a technical advisor on transitional justice at the Justice, Law and Order Sector, Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, that is the government of Uganda. She currently works to support Uganda's transitional justice efforts at the policy level. She led the formation and adoption of the National Transitional Justice Policy, and she worked with the International Center for Transitional Justice, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Northern Uganda, and the Legal Aid Project of the Uganda Law Society in Northern Uganda. She's a lawyer and also an advocate of the Court of Judicature of Uganda. Ms. Margaret, it's welcome. It's your time to present to us. Thank you. Ms. Margaret, can you hear us? Hello, Ms. Margaret. Ms. Margaret, can you hear us now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Wow.
We can hear you.
Okay, my network was being a little bit unstable. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this this webinar. And I'm glad to share comparative experiences. On a positive note, I would like to acknowledge that Uganda has been one of the states parties to the African Union that has adopted a transitional justice policy. We adopted one exactly the same year that the AU adopted the AU-TJP, and that was in June 2019. So basically, the National Transitional Justice Policy of Uganda is one that aims to promote peace, justice, accountability, and reconciliation for post-conflict Uganda. And with this, we aim at using both the formal and non-formal justice processes. And when you asked me to speak about environment, peace building, and transitional justice, I had a little bit of a question about environment, but scanning through our experiences as Uganda and also looking at the contemporary aspects going on with TJ and conflict, I found that actually environment is quite key. So probably giving you a highlight in terms of environmental issues that could be instrumental for our meeting is that you will find that the conflicts in Uganda, and I would showcase the conflict in northern Uganda that lasted over 2 decades, I would say had diverse effects not only on human life, but the environment. One, because the communities had to be put into IDP camps, and that meant that settlements had to be cleared. A lot of the environment had to be cleared in order to create human settlement. So you'll find that lots of trees and lots of boundaries that were there before had to be eradicated because of creation of human settlements for these persons. And obviously also there had to be creation of a lot of army detaches or barracks, as we call them, in order for them to monitor the effects, or rather to monitor the activities of the rebels. Besides that, also, we found that because of the effects of the conflict and also the nature of the conflict, there were lots of landmines that were planted, meaning that most of the land turned out not to be arable. And a lot of that was actually seen at the time of return and resettlement. So if you actually look at the trend of conflict in Uganda, it means that a lot of the environment was depleted due to the conflict. And so we saw effects in terms of the physical environment, and also there in terms of the aerial environment. I do not have any statistics, but you would say that because of the effects of conflict, we have a lot of effects of trauma because children were born during the armed conflict, and that means they had a lot of gunshots and the effects of war. So you find that environment is not only affected physically, but also the other aerial aspects and social aspects. So that is our experience as Uganda in terms of conflict and the environment. Now, when it comes to the policy, the National Transitional Justice Policy, we attempt to capture the aspect of environment as much as we do not explicitly state the aspect of the environment. Under the reparations component, we note that land conflicts have been one of the effects of the armed conflicts in Uganda. And having worked with the legal aid project in northern Uganda, most of the cases that I received were cases related to land. And basically these were land boundary conflicts, issues of ascertaining ownership, because traditionally land in northern Uganda, or most of the part of northern Uganda, is owned customarily. So that meant that most of these lands are untitled, and people would only rely on physical aspects like maybe trees, or maybe burial sites, or maybe homes that were constructed in these areas. So you would find that after the conflict, most of these demarcations like the trees or the burial sites or the houses were no longer there because they had to go because of the armed conflicts. So as part of the reparations measures, as part of resettlement and reintegration was the aspect of land, where we propose for aspects of land restitution and also aspects of rehabilitation through legal support in terms of legal aid for those who have lost property or land during the armed conflict. And then the other aspect of environment that we capture in the policy is under the cross-cutting issues. Under the cross-cutting issues, we highlight the aspect of climate change that is associated especially with return and resettlement of former IDPs and refugee communities. As already highlighted, the environment was diversely affected during the encampment of persons because of the war in northern Uganda. But then also after the conflict, people were asked to go back to their homes, their former homes of origin. And that also meant further depletion of the environment. That meant cutting more trees. And the other dilemma that we are currently faced with is the hosting of refugees. As you're aware, Uganda is the largest host of refugees in the Great Lakes region. So that means we have refugees from South Sudan, from Congo, those that were from Rwanda who are in Western Uganda. And much of the environment, especially in the refugee hosting communities, has been depleted in terms of helping create a space for settlement of these refugees. So you see it's a dual effect. One, in terms of IDP, when there was internal conflict, and now with the aspect of refugee hosting because of external armed conflicts. So one would probably argue that how then would, one would then argue that as much as we need to support refugees and refugee communities in transitional justice processes, you also see them inadvertently, without intention, acting also as, I wouldn't want to use the word perpetrators, but inadvertently acting as depleters of environment, not because of their intention, but because of the effects of war in their different areas. So those are some of the experiences that we are having right now as Uganda. The other aspect in terms of how have we then been able to address these issues with respect to environment, peace building in the context of transitional justice is that right now, through the Amnesty Commission, which is the organ that is given the mandate to resettle, return, and demobilize persons, as part of the reintegration package, we are supporting them under the justice, law, and order sector to preserve the environment. So now the formerly abducted persons who now have amnesty certificates, and the communities are being supported to run environment afforestation projects where they are planting trees in the areas that were formerly deforested. And then also, just as part of income generating projects, they are even being given seedlings to plant in the communities, and also being supported to undertake other agricultural projects. The other way in which we were able to address the post-war conflict environment issues was that immediately after the cessation of hostilities and in the northern part of the region, government had started a program to support those persons or those communities whose land had been occupied by the IDPs or that had been occupied by the military detaches. However, it's a process that had to be aborted at some stage because it was so extensive in the sense that government did not have the resources to do that, as much as it acknowledged that people had lost land or people had lost property in that regard, but it was a process that couldn't be sustained because of the complications that would be surrounding that. And also especially with complications that would arise in terms of laws of limitation. As you know, in times of armed conflict, the states might have the right, for example, in our constitution, the state has a right to compulsory acquisition of land or property, for example. So one would argue that it sometimes is a futile process to pursue compensation also for lands that have been degraded due to armed conflict because of the laws of limitation and the fact that the states might have at the time had the responsibility to protect, and in lieu of that were able took over or degraded for purposes of protection the different communities. So I do agree with Professor Tim that wars definitely leave scars on communities, and we are seeing this through the degradation of the environment. And as much as now we try to put in place transitional justice processes, I think it's also another complex in terms of trying to put a balance in between how do we address these issues vis-a-vis some of the complexities or some of the necessities that should have taken place in that time. And I would give an example of, as much as the AUTJP stresses the fact that refugee communities and IDPs need to be consulted during TJ processes and need to be to have redress during TJ processes, my question would be, who then would be the responsibility entity? For example, in the case of Uganda, I would give an example of, yes, we have refugee hosting communities. I've been asked several times whether our national transitional justice policy covers aspects of refugees or addresses issues of refugees. And then it's something I think I would also like to throw out there. Would we then give that responsibility to the countries where the refugees are fleeing hostilities to be able to repair them or to address their transitional justice concerns, and or are the hosting countries able to address issues of the refugees in their countries? Because I would give an example of the traditional justice mechanisms that we are exploring in the transitional justice process. For example, traditional justice processes are very specific to communities, and trying to merge them or trying to attempt to find a solution between communities that are not from the same country would be a little bit of a complex. So for me, that's also an issue that I think I would like to throw out there. So then if it's also the issue of environmental degradation in the context of a hosting country, who then bears the responsibility to support the hosting country in terms of, for example, supporting its environment to get back to where it was in that context. Yeah, so in terms of TJ and the environment, I do agree that it's an issue that needs to be pursued, although it's one that I think hasn't been widely applied. That I think this forum, for example, would be one of those that is bringing the issue up there for us for more thought and more discussion, and in terms of helping us be able to get solutions. So I think I'll end there with my discussion. That's what I had to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for those insights. Very well appreciated. Thanks for raising the challenges that come with these issues. Hosting country versus country of origin, who should take the responsibility? We've heard about refugees and the destruction of the environment, which is a reality. You are not blaming them. It is a reality that when we have to take care of refugees, certain environmental issues have to come up. You've raised the issue of rehabilitation and restoration of the environment, which is very key. You've talked about the specificity or the contextualization of traditional justice processes and the question of where do the refugees come in this place. You've talked about landmines and clearance of settlements. Thank you very much for that presentation that resonates with the issues that we have been raising on environment, peace building, and transitional justice. Next, allow me to welcome our next presenter, Dr. Elizabeth Panteren. who will be speaking to us about community justice in environmental peace building. In a brief statement, she was the director of program at Northern Ridgeland Trust, where she coordinated projects and programs within 39 community-led conservancies in Kenya. She is also a chairperson of the Nyayo T-Zones and chair of the State Corporation Board of Directors. She also previously worked for the Community Enterprise Development Department of Kenya Wildlife Service, where she promoted community-led conservation and natural resource-based enterprises. Elizabeth Panteren holds a PhD in sociology and a master's in community development from Nairobi University and also from Kenyatta University. She's passionate about social inclusivity, people-driven development, and environmental transitional justice issue. Dr. Elizabeth, you're welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Munini, and the rest of the panelists. I'm more learned than before. It's good that I'm the last to speak, most probably. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just briefly talk about natural resource management related conflicts in northern part of Kenya. And I'll borrow a lot from Northern Ridgeland Trust peace building initiatives in that part of the landscape. I'm sure most of us are Kenyans, except for one of our sister, Margaret. And so we know that 80% of Kenyan landmass is arid and semi-arid lands. And it sustained 25% of Kenyans' human population. And pastoralism is the main land use system in that ecosystem. Over 50% of country livestock is found in that region. And therefore, the region is mainly prone to ethnic-based conflicts. I mean, several communities fighting over scarcity of natural resources. And I said earlier that the area is predominantly a pastoralism land use, which is a source of livelihood for the pastoralist communities in the north. You also realize that there's a relationship between people, livestock, and environment in that ecosystem. And therefore, most of these communities that are living in the north are pastoralists, and therefore they migrate from one area to another seasonally in search of pasture, water, and utilize the land resources. And therefore they are nomads in nature. And their main source of livelihood is natural resources. And they're driven by their livestock. Livestock is the main source of livelihood. Therefore, in this ecosystem, or the landscape, or this environment, we realize that there's interaction between natural resource systems, resource users, who are the pastoralists, and the larger geopolitical systems that define pastoralism way of life. In this ecosystem, historically, there has always been tension along the northern part of Kenya, that is Marsabit, Turkana County, Baringo, those of us who are familiar with the landscape. And you realize that the tension or the disputes is over the natural resources, access to natural resources. These natural resources include land, water, grazing rights among different ethnic groups. And the dispute flare up among the pastoralists themselves. They themselves, different groups or clans or ethnic groups, fight because of the need to feed their livestock and the need to feed themselves. And these tensions comes up during the dry season. Now, what are the effects of this tension? You realize that there's a lot of stock raiding as a result, and that then have an issue on food security. And also there's also interrupted social services. Once they fight, Some of the services like medical health centers, schools are closed, and that also disrupts their way of life. The other impact of this conflict is poverty. Poverty is another issue. So women and children and the elderly are left at home while the others are migrating in search. The male members of the society migrate around to look for pasture for their livestock. And those who are vulnerable and victim of this are the women and the children, the elderly. Some of them are forced to migrate from their ancestral lands from one area to another. And so you realize that there's a lot of displacement. You also realize that some of these landscapes are bordering other regions like other countries. So there's porous border and the issue associated with small arms. And so they equip themselves with arms so that they are able to fight. So what happened as a result of peace, and it is the correlationship between environment and pastoralism as a source of livelihood. Conservation agencies like Northern Ranger and Trust, Kenya Wildlife Service, attempted to initiate community-led conservancies as a transitional justice mechanism. And these institutions called community-led conservancies entry points to peace building. So you realize that several communities are empowered to be able to demarcate their lands or set aside their ancestral land so that they are able to effectively manage the natural resources and utilize the same to be able to improve their livelihoods. So conservancies play a very important role in that way, because the communities themselves are the one driving the process of sustainable utilization of the natural resources, at the same time realize how to manage the same resource for future use. In this case then, you realize that groups of communities who are initially fighting are now having forums to discuss on how they will collectively use the resources and utilize them sustainably to reduce the conflict of the same resources. And that is only aimed at, or mainly aimed at, bringing stability, peace, and kind of a dialogue where communities now sit down and ask themselves how they can be able to utilize the same scarce resources. So the conservancy model then create platform for different social structures. We have council of elders, we have women, we have youth, we have government security apparatus coming together to be able to develop transitional justice or redress mechanism to be able to address the issues. And also realize that as a result of the community conservancies, the programs that community conservancies themselves run are initiatives that promote a culture of peace thinking. People must have to think and change their behaviors, think about peace, and also have what we call non-violent conflict approaches to situations. They also develop governance structures in the conservancies, where one conservancy will reach out to another conservancy and be able to negotiate on grazing plans. They develop grazing plans, they have rangeland plans, and they are able to discuss on how to use local traditional knowledge to be able to use the land that is available, instead of them having conflict over the same land. So this then helped the conservancies also diversify other means of revenues or livelihood apart from pastoralism. You realize that some of them have gone into agro-pastoralism, some of them have gone into tourism, and that increases revenue streams to them, and so reduce reliance on environment, natural resources for that matter. In conclusion, therefore, according to natural resource or environment intervention like conservancy models, peace, livelihood, and environment are like three-legged stool in that matter, and they are necessary for sustainable use of the natural resources. And as a result, we have seen reduced kind of conflict that are related to natural resources. But now there are more pronounced, other pronounced emerging source of conflict apart from natural resources as a result. One is historical, as mentioned by our team. There are historical injustices that are related to what is happening in the northern part of Kenya. Issues of economic and social marginalization of the indigenous people. They were left behind from the beginning, so their levels of or speed at which they are able to catch up is seriously wanting. There's also unequal distribution of government services. Some community feel that one community is more bestowed with powers and therefore they have more resources. There's also proximity to the border. One community is more accessible to weapons than the other. And also there's the impact of climate change. So there's climate change variability, and so trying to use traditional knowledge alone is not sufficient. It's also necessary to see how they can do both a blend of conventional and traditional knowledge. There's also political antagonism. One ethnic group is more politically empowered and use supremacy to suppress the other group. So basically, that again needs some transitional justice mechanism where we can be able to see how we can address conflict outside natural resource management. Briefly, I think, Mulini, that is what I wanted to share as a case for Northern Kenya environmental conservancy's story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elizabeth, for that sharing, for that insight. Thanks for sharing with us the conservation model and raising the challenges that you face in reference to same. We've seen you've raised the issue of indigeneity and the pastoralists and the fact that they have been left behind in quotes, but also the use of traditional knowledge, because despite the fact that they are still living in the indigenous way, they still have traditional knowledge that can be used. You've talked about ADR processes that are being used to address disputes, cooperation in utilization of these resources, which is a key component of environmental peace building, where we talk about cooperation so that the use of resources amongst warring communities or persons can actually create strategies of working together. So conservancies as entry points for peace building, that is very interesting. You've talked about the tensions and the raiding of stock because of conflicts that happen within the region. We've also heard about borders and the coming in of weapons from across the countries that continue to perpetrate the conflicts that we see within those regions. So in a snapshot, you're also raising the question, the issue that not only are natural resource-based conflicts separate, but they are also affected by other issues. And you've also mentioned the question of politics. So it's a combination of issues that continue to perpetrate these conflicts, despite the fact that natural resources are also an issue of contention. Thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth, for that presentation and for those insights. So it's time for questions. I would like to open up the floor for questions, and I have seen in the chat we have a question and we have a few more questions coming in. I will give the question to John. There's a question for one of our panelists, John. The question is, any idea on feasibility of establishing a legally binding environmental rights treaty in Africa? Any feasibility of establishing an environmental rights treaty in Africa? The other question goes to also John. You raised the question of decentralization when you were talking about, sorry. alternative when talking about truth and reconciliation commissions. And in the past, we have seen a challenge with should I call it decentralization or separation, especially in relation to conflicts that have natural resources that are shared. For instance, the question of Sierra Leone and Liberia, where we have cross-border shared resources, and the truth commissions or the tribunals were working separately. So they could not share the information so that they can hold accountable or they can address the issue of resources that are crossing borders to help fund the conflict. What do you think about decentralization and a regional approach, especially when it comes to resources that are shared across the border? Another question goes to Margaret. Margaret talked about landmines. And the question is, what has the Uganda team done in terms of restoration and rehabilitation of the land that has been affected by these landmines in reference to the justice, the TJ process? Another question is in the traditional, any indigenous strategies that a question to Tim, sorry, a question to Professor Tim. You talked about reconciliation with the earth or reconciliation with the environment. And the question is, are there any traditional restoration strategies you can share that could be used to reconcile the people and the earth? You talked about colonialism, and colonialism actually came in and destroyed quite a lot of structures that used to exist within the African communities and the African continent, also in reference to how they related to the environment. So the question is, are there any traditional restoration strategies that you can share with us? Any more upcoming questions we will share? Maybe for now, we can have our panelists respond to those questions. Maybe we can start with John and then Tim and then Margaret and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mumwini. I think the first question from Shamisa, the African Union, as you will recollect, we do have what we call the Maputo Convention on National Research and on Natural Resources and Conservation, 1963 Convention. And as you know, these issues of, it was not popularly known as environment then. You know, the concept of environment issues later on came. But the African Union in 1963 do have this Maputo Convention, which deals with natural resources and also conservation, and which revolves around the issues of environment. And this is a convention that is, you know, very important and also binding, because it is a document that was adopted by all. But you know, it was renewed in 2003. As when the issue of environment came up as an issue, then that was how it was renewed then to deal with the issues of environment. So we do have that particular document in place. The second issues that was raised has to do with the issues of decentralization and regional TJ mechanisms. What I was trying to say with regards to decentralization, making reference to the Nigeria, is to argue that it is one of the new practices now that we are beginning to see, where transitional justice don't have to be national in nature if such conflicts or authoritarian regime is not national by orientation. And I was making reference to Nigeria, where we have transitional justice mechanism in 2 states in the country. One state is called Kaduna State, then the other one is called Plateau State, where these 2 states, you know, outside of the national framework, have initiated their own transitional justice mechanism. So this is the type of decentralization of TJ that I was talking about. But having said that, the issue that you raise with regard to cross-border natural resources, and in addition to that, we also have cross-border, you know, conflict crisis. And that is the reason why it is very fundamental, particularly these days, that we have a sub-regional transitional justice mechanisms or framework in place. Let me give you one example. In West Africa now, ECOWAS has what we call this protocol on free movement. This protocol of free movement does promote free movement among the ECOWAS citizens from one country to the other. But of recent, there is now a challenge with regard to herders and farmers, crisis. We have this ethnic group called the Fulani that are mostly herders, and they live in different countries in West Africa, in Mali, Burkina Faso, and different Guinea, and so on. And these herders, particularly during the dry season, they move across borders in different countries. And one of the crises now that is brewing in Nigeria is this herders and farmers crisis, where we have, this Fulani that come from different parts of the West Africa to Nigeria, to other countries, Benin, and it's now beginning to become a herders and farmers crisis in West Africa. And now what they are now calling on ECOWAS to come up with initiative to address these particular issues. And the issue of transitional justice is also coming handy. And so it is not out of place that it is now that we need to begin to think of regional mechanism that will address this type of inter-border crisis, inter-border mismanagement or management of natural resources. So it is a question that is very, very important, particularly given the new development across the continent with regard to crises that are cross-border in nature. Thank you.
Thank you for that, John.
Hello, you want me to come in, Munini?
Yes, sure, please.
Okay, sure. So the question was around if there are any indigenous approaches that speak to this healing of the relationship with the earth. So the first one that came to my mind really was the Navajo people of North America, who have a saying that goes, we don't inherit the earth from our parents, we borrow it from our children. So there they bring in the idea of borrowing. That is, means when you borrow something, you want to leave it in at least a good condition as when you borrowed it, if not a better condition than when we received it or when we found it. And so this idea of borrowing means that we have to look after the earth, we have to look after the environment, the animals within the plant kingdoms. These are all kingdoms that interact with human beings and humanity in a way that's supposed to be sustainable. I mean, there's no reason for any one of these kingdoms to exploit the other towards the point of almost extinction. And in Africa, you will find similar notions in a number of indigenous communities. Ethnic groups have similar relationships with the earth. At the moment, we haven't documented sufficient number of these, but I think this is part of the work that we need to do. There's a lot of work that's been done on how to resolve peace between people using these cultural traditions. And I think if we dig deeper into the African cosmology, we'll find that there's also teachings about our relationship with the earth and how we have to maintain and sustain a healthy relationship with the earth. So I think that's some of the additional work that we need to be doing and going forward. Thanks, Munini.
Thank you, Tim, for that.
I think I was asked about what has been done with the landmines. There was a demining process that took place in Uganda even during the time of active armed conflict. So after the conflict, that demining program continued because as communities were going back to their original homes and trying to cultivate, they were being hit by landmines. So it's a process that has been ongoing, and even up to now, the government still requests communities to report any object that they suspect to be a landmine to the nearest army detach or authority. So it's still an ongoing process, although the severity of the number of landmines that still exist have gone down, most likely because most of them have been demined. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that response. Another question is to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, as you continue to work on the conservancy model and the communities in reference to addressing the disputes that relate to natural resources, what is the engagement of the government? Is the government engaged, or is it even interested?
That's a very interesting question, Nini. You want me to accuse the government? Anyway, the government...
No, I wanted to put them in good light. Maybe they...
It's okay. Yeah, in the community conservancy model, you realize that the stakeholders are multifaceted. You realize that natural resource is the mandate of national government. So in Kenya, you will not utilize natural resources without the permit of the government. Number two, the community conservancy scouts cannot go for a patrol to recover livestock. For that matter, they raided livestock without the anti-stock theft police and the GSU. So the government, the structure, the peace building structure and governance system is mainly a collective effort of both the community, the indigenous people, and the government, the administration. But you realize there's always a blame game between the community and the government system. You realize that the community is complaining that the government is taking time to respond to the report that is given. The government do not, for example, the judicial system do not prosecute the offenders. You realize that it takes time. Sometimes there's allegation of corruption. The main offenders are known and yet they are not apprehended, or even if they're taken to court, they are not judged, or they're not, the case is not concluded. You realize that the government is also blaming the community for protecting their own offenders. I mean, every person is protecting his own person. They don't volunteer information. So there's always this blame game between the government and the community. But what has happened with the community conservancy is that we are trying to, there's this initiative in Kenya that's called community policing. So you realize that the communities are now volunteering the guys, the problem, those who are causing problem, and so the government comes in easily to arrest them. And so that is where we have a challenge. At what point do we see the government coming in to now punish or be held accountable for taking some measures that are within the provision of the law? So basically, that is the dilemma in which we are in as community conservancies.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Have you seen any non-traditional peace actors coming on board?
Yeah, each of these ethnic group has what we call traditional council of elders. And their efforts, and yet conservancies are actually ethnic based. So their efforts to have inter-council of elders meeting, ethnic inter-council of elders meeting, where they sit down and address the issues that are related to environment. And also you realize that this council of elders are also polarized. Some of them will want to protect their own. So there's always suspicion between one ethnic group against another, because they feel like they're hiding their own. And so it's not very effective in that manner. And that is where we expect the government to come in now as a neutral body to be able to, using the intelligence systems, to come in and fish out the problem causing individuals within the society. The other big issue is the Council of Elders themselves are compromised by the politicians. So you see they are funded by the politicians, and so they speak on behalf of the politicians. And so there's also mistrust between one ethnic group and another ethnic group. And those are the complexities of a community or societies that do not want to solve problems. The other complex issue is the issue of boundaries. Each ethnic group, historically by colonial government, have demarcated what we call constituencies, wards, you see districts, locations, and they are contentious. You realize that communities are saying this boundary originally belongs to us, but it has been extended by. So you see IEBC as an institution also needs to come in and define boundaries of these communities so that they don't fight over territories. So those are the complexities, Munini, we are finding on the ground. Have I lost you? Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Munini to...
Yes,
Hello?
yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm here, sorry.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, Dr. Elizabeth, for that response. We had a question on the chat. That's what I was trying to access when my network flipped a bit. Sorry, someone was saying something. John, was that you?
No, I was trying to remind you that you should unmute.
Oh, okay, thank you. There's a question and it is from Yande. Margaret, are you able to share a case study of a moment where this has happened with conflicts between displaced communities and host countries and how there was a peaceful resolution? For Margaret. Mm-hmm.
Oh, should I respond or there are more questions? I could hold on for the rest of the panelists.
You can respond or we can ask more questions. The other question would be, as environmental crime in post-conflict peace processes, a lot of the times we see issues related to natural resources and environmental crimes and abuses. The question would be generally to everyone, as a continent within the traditional justice framework, are we ready to hold perpetrators accountable when it comes to environmental crimes or abuses? We're talking about illegal logging that we have seen going on in Congo, Central African Republic. We've seen the depositing of hazardous waste in countries like Somalia, the Somalia coastline, amongst other places. We've seen illegal fishing in West Africa. All these have an impact on the environment and its natural resources. The question is the transitional justice system willing to hold the players accountable? It's an open question. Margaret, you can go.
Thanks again, Munini and Yenda, for the question. What I expressed is one of the challenges that we are having within the justice sector, at the justice law and order sector. We are promoting the use of alternative dispute resolution in terms of helping with decongestion of case backlog. And even when we consulted the refugee communities and host communities, the refugee communities also expressed a desire to use their own traditional justice mechanisms to resolve conflicts. Now, our complex was that the communities, the host communities most likely are not conversant with the traditional justice mechanisms of the refugees. And that would mean that for any traditional justice mechanism to be successful, both communities at least should be having some semblance of familiarity with the other mechanisms. So of course, in the justice context, we've had lots of conflicts even in terms of violent cases like murders and even sexual offenses. And the challenge has been that some of the refugee communities have been making the defense that some of the crimes, especially the sexual crimes that have occurred, are those that would ordinarily occur in their countries and are not having any legal implications. So that is with a general justice chain. So using traditional forms of mediation, alternative dispute resolution is one that we are not comfortable with, because we have not exhaustively, or not even exhaustively, we haven't actually studied what their traditional justice systems are. So it's one that I expressed as a challenge, and also one that I have expressed as some of our development partners or our stakeholders have expressed interest in knowing whether our transitional justice policy and process will at all address alternative justice needs of the refugee community. So it's one that I would say we are yet to consult on or to inquire into, because the context of the transitional justice policy of Uganda was with regards to our conflicts internally, and not those that extend externally, except for the criminal justice component, which you're aware. In case of the criminal justice component is probably where I would say that refugees can be accommodated, especially if there are lawyers here, they would know about the principles of universal jurisdiction. Also, that if refugees are interested in perpetrators in their countries being prosecuted in the host countries, it's something that can be looked into generally as a legal option. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. One of our panelists, would you like to go on the general question?
No. Well, I think for looking at it from the African Union transitional justice policy, with regard to issues that you raised, whether transitional justice cover all those logging and all the rest of them, that is the reason why the African Union transitional justice give a leeway, for the member states to put into consideration, to take into consideration the context and expand their own policy, but drawing from the African Union transitional justice policy. So, for example, where logging and environmental degradations in some of the countries are problems leading to conflict, crisis, and other, they could incorporate that as part of their transitional justice mechanism. And as you know, transitional justice mechanisms varies. It does not necessarily have to be TRC alone. There are different mechanisms in place. So each countries will have to look at their own environment and then contextualize. There is nothing bad in any country coming up with a totally different and unique TJ mechanisms that we address the challenges that they are facing, whether in time of environment, whether in time of other authoritarian rules. So I think contextualization, which the African Union Transitional Justice Policy emphasizes, is really comes in handy with regard to this question that was asked. Thank you.
Thank you, John. A question to Elizabeth. Large-scale environmental projects such as conservation parks can also lead to displacement of local people, as they also lead to evictions and access restrictions for local people who had lived on the land for decades. How does environmental peace building evolve to address new emerging conflicts? A question from Miriam. A question from Franklin. But thanks for the invitation, very interesting. One quick suggestion, comment, recommendation, though, is need to really have a clear conceptualization and or linkage of TJ and environment, and what will a TJ mechanism look like, of course, considering contextual relevance as noted by John. That was a comment that says, there's a need to really have a clear conceptualization and or linkage of TJ and environment, and what will a TJ mechanism look like, of course, considering contextual relevance as noted by John. That's a comment. And the last question, how do we respect traditional justice systems with modern justice systems? This also goes hand in hand with the talk of boundaries. Some of the policies can be quite outdated or not in line with the extraction, environment abuse that goes on in this day, or in some way too modern and not properly disseminated within communities. So injustices continue to occur due to lack of accessibility and understanding due to language barriers. That's an open question. I repeat the question, it's from Yande. How do we respect traditional justice systems with modern justice systems? This also goes hand in hand with the talk of boundaries. Some of the policies can be quite outdated or not in line with the extraction or environmental abuse that goes on in this day, or in some way too modern and not properly disseminated within communities. So injustices continue to occur due to lack of accessibility and understanding due to language barriers. That's an open question. So we can start with Elizabeth, and then we can have the open question, and our panelists can give us their final remarks. We are running out of time. Thank you. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Munini. The issue of protected areas and displacement of indigenous people around the protected area is real and has happened, and it is happening. Most of these states or nations or governments have created protected areas with no consultation with the indigenous people that were originally the holders or the land owners of that particular area. So what happened is that there has been a bad relationship between the government and the indigenous people surrounding the protected areas. And because there's restriction, there's no access, there's no benefit coming from the protected areas. So the people, the indigenous people, feel like they have been left out of the management and the establishment of the same. So what happened is that in this case, there are some countries through IUCN. IUCN is an international convention, and there's what we call co-management. Some countries have, or states have started negotiating with indigenous people around the protected areas to have what we call co-management structures. Co-management structures is that the management of that particular protected area is constituted in a manner that it has representation from the indigenous people that are adjacent to the parks. And also during the recruitment of the staff of the same protected areas, the indigenous people structures have been involved in the recruitment process. So you realize that some states are now moving towards engaging the indigenous people around the protected areas so that they can feel part and parcel of the management of the same protected areas. But in Kenya, you realize that Kenya has gone the conservancy way. The Kenya Wildlife Service have initiated community conservancies adjacent or neighboring the conservancies, and so support ecotourism activities so that the visitors coming from the park can easily access to the protected areas. So there is a kind of a shift in terms of resolution of that kind of a related problem, so that people are now part and parcel of the management of protected areas in one way or another. I think that is the little I can tell about that.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Maybe if I would delve in with the aspect of the traditional justice mechanisms and reconciliation with the modern justice systems, and the fact that some of them would be outdated. The experience we've had as in our context is that we now are developing guidelines on informal justice mechanisms that clearly state the linkage between some informal justice mechanisms, which would include the traditional justice mechanisms and the formal justice mechanisms. And the check that we are putting in place is that we are ensuring that the traditional justice mechanisms that would be applied are those that are not in contravention with the laws of Uganda, and of course, meaning that they should be alive to principles of natural justice, equity, issues of human rights, issues of sensitivity to aspects of women, children, and other aspects of vulnerability. So yes, we agree, and we know that certain aspects of traditional justice mechanisms might be outdated. Obviously, for aspects of evolution and memory, we have a fairly young population that probably does not remember all this, but using the institutional memory within the traditional institutions, we are able to, we are attempting to harmonize what we can, especially with the aspect of promotion of reconciliation, and social cohesion and coexistence, which is a strong norm that the traditional justice mechanisms have that are not inbuilt in the formal court system. So we are clearly coming up with a proper guide to support the communities and also the courts, because we had a legal challenge recently in a case of murder, where one of the parties sought to use the traditional justice mechanism in place of the formal justice system. And in the judge's ruling, he noted that as much as he acknowledged the use of traditional justice processes, there wasn't yet a properly streamlined mechanism to apply them in line with the formal courts. And I think also that's one of the issues that the ICC noted in the case of Dominic Ongwen, in the case of the LRA. So it's something that we are trying to harmonize through proper guidelines and policy, which the transitional justice policy of Uganda provides for.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for those sentiments. Tim, do you have a final?
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, I think there's always tension around the tradition versus the modern. But we have to recognize that both have issues that need to be addressed. And tradition-based approaches tend to be quite patriarchal by design, because the world we live in is a very patriarchal world, and also reflects this desire to dominate and exploit the environment. And the modern systems tend to be very individualistic in their design, and still also perpetuate an extractive agenda, which is ultimately destructive to the environment. So it's always a case of drawing upon the best practices of both processes, right? To see what is it of value that we can learn as human beings that can help our societies to flourish and to improve. So that's my take on that. And I think our traditions will have a lot of important insights, particularly around resolving disputes and treating nature with respect. And so that's my take on that. And then on the issue of accountability, whether transitional justice mechanisms can deliver accountability, on particularly environmental exploitation and damage, it is ultimately for human actors who have agency to make this work. The policy itself is not going to achieve anything. Mechanisms themselves do not work automatically. Similarly with institutions, it's the people who have to influence those who are inside institutions to make things work, or in fact communities of like-minded people, of individuals mobilizing, building optimal mass to make things happen. I saw a question around, an environmental protection regime for Africa based on a treaty. That wouldn't come about just by itself. You have to agitate for it in the same way that the AUTJP came about through a lot of agitation over 10-year period to actually get to the AUTJP from 2010 to 2019. 9 years or so. So it's quite, that's the agenda we need to adopt in terms of how we go about addressing these issues. It's not going to happen by itself. We have to become the actors that make these things happen. Yeah, thanks, Munini.
Thanks very much, Tim. Very true. We have to make it happen. John, do you have any final remarks?
Thank you very much, Munini. I think this is very exciting and useful interaction. And like we used to say, globally speaking, there is no perfect policy nor normative framework document where there would be no room for improvement in one way or the other. And what this discussion has brought forth, is the fact that the need for us also to focus more on transitional justice and the environment, particularly given the new development in time of conflict crisis that are fueled by environmental factors. So I want to believe that organizations like yours could also come up, with initiatives that will help to buttress and also to complement the efforts of the African Union in this area by coming up, with initiatives and also programs to support the African Union in promoting justice, peace, reconciliation, and development through a program that bring about nexus between environment and transitional justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. A very good closing remarks, and that's why we call us to continue with the discussions in our next series of webinars. We continue with this discussion in June, July, and August. So we will update you. Keep checking the website for more details, the Environmental Peacebuilding website, but we'll also keep sending emails to tell you when the next discussion is. Our email will be shared on the chat section. And also just to mention that there are more discussions on other topics related to environment and peace building on the road to Geneva. The website has been shared. You'll also find it on the chat. Allow me to appreciate very much our panelists, Professor Mureithi, Mr. John, Dr. Elizabeth, and Margaret for the discussions, for opening up our minds, for enriching the talk. And
Munini,
as John has said,
it's not very good.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was saying that we welcome you to continue with this discussion. In our next series of webinars, we will continue talking about this issue of the African Union Transitional Justice policy in June, July, and August. And we also welcome you to check the website for more details. We will send emails to inform you on what is coming up next. But also just to mention, we want to welcome you to visit the Environmental Peacebuilding Association website, where we have the Road to Geneva initiative. There are more discussions referring to more issues that relate to environment and peace building, not only within the African continent, but also within other continents. We're talking about issues related to water, to forestry, a lot of discussions. So you're welcome. And I wanted to thank our panelists dearly. Thank you, Mr. John. Thank you, Professor Mureithi. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth. Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you for putting the time and for putting together the sentiments that you've shared today, for the insights that you've given us today. And thank you so much for your patience. This is to our participants, and without whom the discussions would not have happened. We want to appreciate the questions, and we also want to appreciate the hosts who've made this webinar possible, the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and the Bosch Alumni Network, and the teams that are working behind, Sheila, Claire, and others who are making sure that our webinars are working and that the invites and the links have gone on time. Again, you will find this recording and it will also be shared via email. But if you go to our website, you'll also find several recordings of discussions that have gone on, including the discussion we had yesterday on environment and peace building. Until next time, I want to thank you all once again, and I want you to welcome and continue with this discussion. As John said, we're having a training for young people on Monday to talk about the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. So if the young people are doing it, we can also continue with this discussion. Thank you and have a good evening. And we look forward to seeing you in June, July, and August as we continue to discuss the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.